Today's daf is daf nun, and we begin on the top line. De akashta kuliyamalo pligi diasur. Right, there was a machlokes in the traditions of Eretz Yisrael and Bavel, but with regard to the bow, because the keva is actually shaped like a bow. In other words, it has um, a curved bottom and more or less a kind of a flat top. It's not exactly flat, but anyway, so that's called a bow, like a keshet. So the word akashta comes from the word keshet, which is like an arrow that has two parts to it. And everyone agrees that the fat on the bow is certainly forbidden. There's no question about that. That chelev is also. Ki pligi de ayaisra. So ayaisra is that string, so to speak, uh, where the bow meets that string. And that's going to be, according to this Lishna, the machlokes between Bavel and Eretz Yisrael, where the fat over there on this bowstring, as we said, is it considered a chelev? Because if you recall, we had a machlokes yesterday on Daf Nun Mem Tesamid Beis between Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva. Now, Rabbi Akiva had a lenient view because he added a third condition to the chelev which the Torah prohibits. And he said that anything that's what we call non-draping, it doesn't have that third condition, is mutter. The Bavel tradition, on the other hand, is machmir because they follow Rabbi Shmuel's view that even if it's non-draping, nevertheless it's forbidden as long as it has the other simonim, which we spoke about, like niklaf and so forth. In any event, what we're learning here now is that even in Bavel, according to this particular Lishna, the fat is considered permitted. So that even if we paskin like Rabbi Shmuel l'chumra, which is the Babylonian tradition, nevertheless, with regard to the Isra, which is the bowstring, that fat is certainly permitted. However, Ika di Amri, we have another lashon which is going to go as follows: the Isra kuli amalo pligi d'shari. There was never an issue about a yaisra, meaning the bowstring. That fat is certainly mutter, right? Because as we said before, it doesn't have the yosef. It's not a draping fat, but rather it adheres, it sticks. And then it means, according to the Sikha Diamri, everybody accepts Rabbi Akiva's view that you need that third condition of draping in order to include it in the pasuk of Chelev Asher Ala Keva. But keep pligi the machlokas now between the various traditions of Bavel and Eretz Yisrael is regarding the Akashta. On the contrary, on the bow part, the chelev on the bow, where according to the Bavloim, the fat of the bow is considered draping fat. It's fundamentally a drape, meaning again, it doesn't stick to the tissue, it sort of like drapes over it. And therefore, according to Bavel, even Rabbi Akiva would agree, because now we're assuming that both traditions accepted Rabbi Akiva, but here even Rabbi Akiva would concede that it's treif. Whereas Eretz Yisrael, they don't consider the fat on the bow to be a drape. And Rashi explains that the reason for that is because there's a point at which it's connected to the keva. So according to this Mesorah, the fat in this particular case is mutter. It's amongst the fats that are mutter. So now we go back to the first Lishna here that we had the two Lishonos, according to which the machlokes between Eretz Yisrael and Bavel about addresses or is concerned with the akashta, which is the fat on the bow. I'm sorry, what did I just say? The fat on the bow is, according to everybody, is asur. That wasn't an issue. But rather, machlokes is with regard to the fat on the bowstring, on the isra, in which case the minig of Eretz Yisrael reflects the shita of Rabbi Akiva, who says that that fat would be mutter, that chaylev is mutter. Ki ha the omer of Avi Omer mekamtzin. Now, what does the word mekamtzin mean? Lekametz means when you skin off something of the surface. And in this case, when we're talking about the bowstring, which is, according to the first Lishna, the subject of the machlokas between Bavel and Eretz Yisrael, so we're going to go ahead, that's our tradition, and we're going to skim off the fat on the bowstring, and then we'll eat the rest. And v'chein omer av yanai mishum zaken echad, some unidentified anonymous scholar also said mekamtzin. Now, we want to point out here that this is all going back to Rav Ami. Rabbi Ami was actually from Eretz Yisrael. So it sounds like even in Eretz Yisrael, where they were matir the fat on the bowstring, nevertheless, lechatchila, they would do this mekamtzin thing and skim it off. So they were machmir, lechatchila, like the tradition of Bavel. Omer of Avya Havika Imna Kamid Rabbi Ami. I was in front of Rabbi Ami, and in fact, Komtzu Vahovali V'yochal. They skimmed off the surface of the fat of the isra, meaning the bowstring, and they gave me the rest of the fat that was underneath that surface level of fat, and he ate it. Shamei is a Heisbacher, a Shamish, and of Rabbi Chanina, Havikoi Kamid Rabbi Chanina, right? He was attending to Rabbi Chanina. Amalei Rabbi Chanina said to him, Kmotz Havli di Echel, skim off the surface of the fat of this bowstring, and then I'll eat the rest of the fat. Chazi de Havikoma Hases. He saw that the attendant was tzitering, as we say in Yiddish. She was very hesitant. Amalei Bavloyat. That's because you came from Bavel, and therefore you follow the tradition of Bavel, and therefore the fat on the keva is completely asur. Gum shedei. So then you'll have to cut off all the fat, throw it away, and we won't eat the fat. Tanya, we learned in the Brisa, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel Omer. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel makes a statement, V'nei ayin shenikfu. So now we're going to talk about the kishkis, and there was a puncture in the intestines. V'lecha sosman. And now there's liquids that come out and they clog up the nekev, that puncture in the intestines. Kshera, the animal is kosher. My lecha, what is this fluid that clogs up the puncture of the intestines? Omar Rav Kahana, shirka de me'aya. Me'aya is the Hebrew word for the intestines, me'ayim. And shirka means a kind of a sticky fluid. Dinofik agav dochka. The sticky fluid of the intestines that comes out through pressure. Now, what is this pressure that causes this fluid to come out? He says here in the name of Rashi that this mucus, adheres strongly to the intestinal lining and can be removed there only with difficulty. So anyway, it's some sort of a thick fat. Tanya, we learned in the price. All right, so this, Gmiri Chavre de Rabbi Ami, Abba Bar Me Rabbi Abba. So there were a group of students or colleagues of Rabbi Abba, and they learned a ruling from Rabbi Abba. Manu, and who are these colleagues of Rabbi Abba? That's none other than Rabbi Zera. Rabbi Amri lechavri de Rabbi Zera mi Rabbi Zera. Others say this tradition was from the colleagues of Rabbi Zera, who derived a tradition from Zera Mani Rabbi Abba. The bottom line is, Amar Rabbi Abba b'shmei Rabbi Chia bar Abba, Hachi Amar Rabbi Chia bar Abba Rabbi Yochanan. Halacha ki Rabbi Shimon Gamliel b'treifa, halacha ki Rabbi Shimon be'evel. There are two rulings of Rabbi Shimon in two different areas of halacha, and we accept both of them. We're going to see later on that that's not so simple. One area is the area of treifa, and the other area is the area of avelus. Halacha of Shimon Gamliel b'treifa ha'di'amaran. Right, this was the ruling that we mentioned, that the mucus that comes out of the intestines, if it's thick and it's sticky, then it plugs up the puncture in the intestine. And that for sure we're going to paskin and accept Rav Shimon Gamliel. However, there's another ruling of Rav Shimon Gamliel which is a little bit more controversial. And that's in Eiffel. Mahi, what is? So what we're learning now is Moed Katan. Moed Katan deals with the laws of Avelus. And we have something called the Shmua Rechoka, which means that, let's say the person died on Sunday, and most of the family is already sitting Shiva starting on Sunday, but then there's a member of the family who's far away, and he joins them a few days later. And the question is, does he have to observe the entire 7 days, and means he'll go beyond the 7 days of Shiva, or no, he could just do those last 3 days, or 4 days, whatever it is. And now the issue is, how far away is he? And how much of the Avelus did he miss? Kol Shlosh Yom Rishonim. In Avelus, we divide up the 7 days into two halachic entities, the first 3 days and the last 4 days. So if, for example, this person, this relative of the deceased, came after the 3 days, okay, fine. So where's he coming from? So again, we have two factors here. Number one, when did he actually show up in the base Avel? And number two, how far removed was it? So Bami Makom Karov. Now, Makom Karov means he's within a journey of 1 day. Mona Imahem. Why? Because he'll have most of the days of Shiva, even though he missed the first 3 days, and he's considered Makom Karov, because he's within a day's journey. However, Mi Makom Rachok, if he's 2 days' journey away from the place where the Krovim are sitting Shiva, Mona Liatzmo, then he's going to have to sit Shiva for a full 7 days, and that means he'll go 3 days beyond the Shiva of the rest of the Krovim. All this is according to the Tanakam. Mikan Vielech, let's say he arrives on day 4 of the Shiva, Afilim Mimakum Karov, even though he was within 1 day's journey, Mona Liatzmo, he has to count a full 7 days. So again, the only what's the word I want to use? The only dispensation, or whatever the word is, that will allow him to join up with the Shiva is if 2 conditions are met. Number 1, he's b'makom karov, and number 2, he comes before the end of the 3rd day of Shiva. Rabbi Shimon Omer, however, afil b'yom hashvi, all we need is makom karov. If that that relative was within 1 day's journey, then even if he comes on the very last day of Shiva, it says, Afil b'yom hashvi, ba mimokom karov, mona imohem. Now, Rabbi Yochanan tells me that we paskin like Rabbi Shimon not only with regard to treifa, in those liquids, those sticky fluids that plug up the intestinal, what's called puncture, but also like Rabbi Shimon that anyone coming from Makom Karov can hook on to the very last day of Shiva. However, the Gemara says the following. Omar Mandahu, somebody said when he heard Rabbi Abba saying this in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Iski v'esak ve'egmer l'shmaita mipumi demar. I'm going to go on a trip to Eretz Yisrael, and I want to hear it, so to speak, from the horse's mouth, and see exactly if the tradition that we're having is accurate. Kisolik, he goes to Eretz Yisrael, and there he meets Rabbi Abba. Ashkeche Rabbi Abba, Amalei, Omar Mar Halacha. Is it really true that, as they quote you, that you said Halacha Reb Shimon ben Gamliel b'treifa? Amalah ha ein halacha amri. Oh, okay, so I missed that point. The Rabbi Abba, when we got to him and we heard it straight from his mouth, he denied that he said that the halacha is like Shimon Gamliel in treifa. Then they asked him, Shimon Gamliel b'Yov Hilmai, what about this quote that they say that you paskin like Shimon Gamliel? Is that also, false? What do they call fake news? Right? Amalei plugtaninu. In fact, this is a machlokes. We don't know whether we accept Reb Shimon Gamliel in Avelus or not. To Itmar, Rav Chizda Omar Halacha, we paskin like Reb Shimon Lekula in Avelus. V'chein Omar Rab Yochanan Halacha. However, Rav Nachman Omar Ein Halacha. However, we have a rule, as we'll see in just a second, halacha kedivrei hamekil ba'avel. So therefore, halacha, the final conclusion is ein halacha of Shimon Gamliel b'treifa, because when we got to Rabbi Abba, he denied that he ever said it, and really what he said is that we don't paskin like Rav Shimon Gamliel in treifa, but halacha of Shimon ba'avel. Whenever we have a controversy in Avelus, we could always go lekula. Since Reb Shimon was the maker, we'll paskin like Reb Shimon. Rav Shimi bar Chia makifim b'bnei me'ayin. In other words, if we have a puncture in the intestines, and we're not sure whether that puncture took place before the shechita or after the shechita, then what we could do is we could take the intestines, make a puncture, and compare its color to the intestine, the puncture that we found. If it's the same, then we assume it was after shechita. If it's a different color, then we have to assume that this puncture took place before the shechita, and a puncture in the intestines makes the animal treifa. Apparently, this issue of finding a puncture in the bnei me'ayim was quite common. And as we said it many times, Rava in this parak is like the kingpin. Very often they brought these shilas to Rava. Akfinhu velo idmu. Now, akfinu velo idmu means they made a puncture now. They compared it to the puncture that they found initially after the shechita, and they were different. So at this point, Rava is about to declare that this intestines and the animal is treif. However, Asar of Mesharsha Brei, Rava's son, whose name was Mesharsha, he had a svara that Rava wasn't aware of, and Rava accepted that svara and was machshir. And what was that? Memashmesh behu v'idmu. He took these new holes and he did mishmush. What's mishmush? Mishmush means when you rub them, it's like what do they call those cubes, that people, for nervous tension, they squeeze them. Anyway, so Amalei Minolachaha, did you have some sort of tradition? This brilliant idea. Amalei Kama Yodi Mishamshu B'Hama Kami Delesa Kami Demar. I'm just using my logic. I mean, this question of the intestines came to you after many people, had rubbed the intestines. So therefore, if we're going to make a hole now and puncture a hole in the intestines, in order to make a fair comparison to that puncture, we have to also do mishmash. Amalei, and Rava was so excited about what his son said, Chakim brave Trefos Rabbi Yochanan. You're as brilliant in Trefos as Rabbi Yochanan. Apparently, Rabbi Yochanan was considered a great posek in Trefos, or maybe it means in general we paskin like Rabbi Yochanan in Isurim, and you deserve to be upgraded. Rabbi Yochanan of Rabbi Eliezer Diamitravai Makifim Bereya. Okay, so we have now a puncture in the lungs, and now we don't know if the puncture came before the shechita or after the shechita, so now we'll make a puncture, and we're going to compare it to that puncture. Amar Rava Lo Amar, when do we allow for the comparison between the new hole that we're going to puncture now and the old hole in order to determine through the similarity that the puncture was after shechita? Lo Amar Nela Bi Osa Ruga. Okay, so you may remember that the rhea, the lungs, are made up of lobes, right? Rows of lobes. And there were 2 and 3. I'm just trying to remember which was on which side. Second. The lungs of an animal consist of two distinct lungs, each of which has a row of several lobes. Rava maintains that the method of comparing two holes is viable only when both are in the same row of lobes, which means that both holes have to be made in the right lung or in the left lung. Aval me'aruga la'aruga lo. Right? So if you have a row of lobes in the left, and there was a hole in one of those lobes, now you made a hole in the row on the right, that is not going to be an effective test to determine the kashrus of the animal. Hilchasa, how do we paskin? Afilu me'aruga la'aruga, even if we compare one row to another row, not always do we guarantee that that's a valid comparison. We need other conditions. Obviously, we have to go from one aruga to another aruga. But we also need to go midaka ladaka, migasa lagasa, from small to small and large to large, at different sizes of lobes. Avalo migasa ladaka velo midaka lagasa. So this was a Gemara that we had back on Daf Mem Vav, that each row of the lungs is composed of uma, right? That's a large lobe. The word uma means a mother lobe. And unos. Unos are ear-like lobes, meaning small lobes. So the Gemara here refers to the uma, which is the large lobe, and una as the small lobe. While a comparison can be made in these rows, but a hole in the uma can only be compared to a hole in the other uma, right and left. A hole in an una can only be compared to a hole in another una. A hole in an uma cannot be compared to a hole in an una, or vice versa. Okay, now we have the windpipe, and we have a hole in the windpipe. And here we have a diagram. And once again, we want to know if the hole in the windpipe was there already at the time of the shechita or it came after the shechita. And Rava and Abaye are going to both say makifin. Makifin means we make a hole now in the windpipe, and we're going to compare it. Amar of Papa, Lo Amoron. Okay, now we have the windpipe is made up of what we call chulios and bar chulios. So honestly, for this, I'd have to see it in real life. The picture doesn't do it justice. All I can tell you is that the windpipe has rings around it. And 3 rings make up a chulia. So a chulia is like a group of 3 rings. But what you have to know here is, in order to appreciate this sugya of bar chulia, you have to know how the animal is situated. Because you got to know which is the top of the animal and which is the bottom of the animal, so that you'll be able to figure out which is the chulia and which is the bar chulia. So let's just read the Gemara. Rav Papa says, "Be osa chulia, v'o michulia chulo," and hilchasafil michulia chulia, mi bar chulia bar chulia, v'lo michulia bar chulia, v'lo mi bar chulia chulia. So what is the bar chulia? Bar means like a subcategory. So there's the main chulia on one side of the windpipe, and then there's the sub chulia on the second side. And you can't make an artificial puncture and compare from the bottom to the top. But we have to know how the animal is situated. So he says the following. At the top of the throat side, which the throat side I think is called the tsavar, right? That's on the top. That's on the top when the animal lies on its back. So we're not talking about after the shechita when you hang up the animal from its legs, but rather you're talking about the shochet's perspective as he lays the animal down on the back and does the shechita. Now, the cartilage rings of the windpipe, the trachea, are thick. These gradually thin as they slope down to the bottom, right? So again, there's a difference between the upper, the throat side, and the bottom, which is the lower side. And that's called the bar chulia. So anyway, since it's different in terms of the thickness as a result of cartilage or the lack of cartilage, therefore we can't compare the top to the bottom. Amrav Zeira. Okay, so now we're talking about the rectum. And even though it's punctured, and the Mishnah doesn't address this question, Zeiri says it's kosher. And this is the last section at the bottom of the colon. And it sort of exits from the cavity of the stomach, and it's encased in the bones of the hips. The hip bones encase the rectum on each side. On top of that, again in this picture, there's the spinal column above and cartilage below. So therefore, because the hip bones on each side support or encase the rectum, therefore, even though it has a puncture, it's still being supported by the hip bones. V'kama. Now, how much of a puncture was there in the rectum? Omrav Eloi, Omrav Yochanan, Makom hadovek berubo. If the majority of the rectum adheres to the hips, then we say it's kosher. Shelo b'makom hadovek, But apparently there's some part of the rectum that is not encased by the hips, and b'mashu, any puncture of the slightest degree makes it into treif. Why? Because it doesn't have that, shall we call it, the support or the encasing of the hips at that point. Nachman Omar, Lav tislu be buki srichi. Meaning, you are accusing of Rav Nachman of something that is buki sruki. Now, the phrase buki sruki appears throughout Shas. It literally translates empty pitchers, but basically you're attributing him to things that he never ever said, as we'll see in the Gemara here on Amud Beis.